Let's now turn to another guest, editor of Spiked Online. You know him well, Brendan O'Neill, who joins us now to talk about all of this. Good morning to you, Brendan.
Hi, Julia.
Good morning. I have to say, it was absolutely fascinating watching the news broadcasters yesterday. The BBC are talking about how that these protests effectively. I mean, they seem to think these protests were largely peaceful, as they tweeted. The Sky News referring in its broadcast to clashes only, and we had the rather absurd situation where the first question to the government minister on the news on Sky News on Sunday morning by Sophie Ridge, a journalist, by the way, who I'm friends with and who I very much like and respect and admire. But her first question was, how many black people are in the cabinet? Was that a relevant question?
I found that question really disturbing. I agree with you. I think Sophie Ridge is a fine journalist and a fine interviewer, but I thought that was actually quite obnoxious. And to pin a cabinet minister down and to say how many blacks are there around that table, I just thought that was actually pretty awful. And even when Matt Hancock was pushing back and saying, well, the people who run the country at the moment are, many of them are non-white. We've got Priti Patel, we've got Suella Braverman, we've got Rishi Sunak. These are high offices of state occupied by people from Asian heritage backgrounds. And even that wasn't enough. And I just find this intense racialization of every aspect of life is really off-putting. And I think if the mainstream media starts to go further down this road of seeing everything through the prism of race, we're going to cause even more racial tensions in this country.
Well, indeed, I think Matthew Hancock pointed out there were a number of very senior, the Chancellor, the Home Secretary, people of colour in the cabinet, because the wrong kind of people of colour, because they weren't black. Of course, when James Cleverly, and we've had other previous members of the cabinet who were black, but when James Cleverly was in the cabinet as the chairman of the Conservative Party, there were complaints from the left and race activists that he wasn't sort of black enough. He was the wrong kind of black person because he didn't share their views, and black people have to apparently all share their views. Otherwise, they're not their Uncle Toms. I mean, that slur was actually used against him, and this is the very, very strange territory we're in. And I want to know more specifically also what do you make of what happened to the statues, the defacing of the Churchill statue, with the Churchill crossed out was a racist. The pulling down of the statue of Edward Colston, who was a 17th century slave, and indeed the attempt to burn flags on the cenotaph before finally police did step in. Lots of people will be very angry about what's happened in terms of the killing of George Floyd and police brutality across the United States, and there have been no doubt incidents here, no question at all. I'm a white middle class woman. Don't tell me I don't get treated differently to a young black man when police stop. Of course I do. Let's stop the pretense. We know there is still racism in our society, but in terms of those acts of defacing statues and putting down statues, what do you make of that?
I think it's really outrageous. I think this is like a tantrum. This is a politically correct tantrum. It now has nothing to do with the killing of George Floyd, which horrified and shocked everyone around the world. People found that deeply disturbing, and people agree that the officers should be charged and questions need to be answered about how police are behaving. But this has now moved on to something else. And I think what we saw in Bristol yesterday with the tearing down of the statue of Edward Colston was like a woke Taliban. The Taliban and ISIS love to destroy old monuments, old pieces of art, old statues that they say are offensive or run counter to one's belief system. And now we have a kind of PC mob doing something similar here, as if the statue is evil and it must be torn down. It's not a progressive thing to do. It's actually incredibly, almost medieval, this notion that these things from the past are harmful and hateful, and we have to destroy them and stamp on them and throw them in the river. I found it quite hysterical, to be honest, and childish. London, where I live, has loads of statues of people who did terrible things to my ancestors in Ireland, but I don't want to tear them. I'm not offended by them because I'm not a child, and I don't want to tear them down because I'm not a narcissist who thinks that the public square has to conform to everything that I think in the 21st century. So I find this appetite for tearing down statues to be completely regressive, worrying, and something that we need to get a handle on.
Brendan O'Neill, always talking sense, editor of Spiked Online. Thank you very much indeed.